on that, it really is an ethics problem, isn't it? So, when we think about things like waste and the fact that it's so easy for, the global north to kind of dump waste in the global south, countries like Ghana are experiencing so much, waste coming from Western countries, and they kind of have to deal with it, and you kind of think it definitely is an ethics problem because, why do certain countries feel like they have more of a right to dump their waste somewhere else? And it becomes their problem. And just to kind of go back on ethics and think about transparency and the supply chain, Vlora, I just wanted to ask you, you've explained how Tony's Chocolonely has been so transparent, and of course, the actual goal of the brand, I guess the chocolate is secondary. It's actually about kind of removing slave trade from this process. But there has kind of been some press that has come out about how there has been discovered some child labour within the supply chain, and the brand has been very open in terms of responding to this and telling all of their customers on the website with a post kind of explaining how this happened, why it happened. But it would be good to hear from you just a bit more about this, I guess, having this come out when the brand is anti-slavery, and especially kind of what are some of the learnings of this, and how we can ensure that we can have an ethical supply chain, especially when you're scaling. It's so difficult to have eyes on absolutely everything that's happening. So it will be interesting to know as well, is that a thing that's possible? Can we scale and have something global and be able to have every single part of our supply chain, free of slavery, free of people being exploited?
Yeah, that's a big question. Maybe some context, because I don't know how many of you will know about the scale of the issue. So 60% of the world's cocoa is produced in West Africa, in Ivory Coast and Ghana, and there are 1.56 million children currently working illegally on cocoa farms. 95% of them do what we call hazardous work, so that's lifting weights that's heavier than themselves, handling machetes, utilizing pesticides. So the scale of the issue is huge. We were having a chat just before we started talking, or just before this panel kicked off. If you guys are interested about this, there's a great kind of documentary available on Netflix called Rotten, and they essentially investigate the issues behind supply chains. So there's an episode about cocoa, there's an episode about avocados, about plastic, about bottled water. And it's really short, but you've got 45 minutes on each kind of industry, and they'll explain all the problems behind kind of cocoa. And as an example, child labor, modern slavery, deforestation. It's so many kind of problems behind each industry. We're very focused about fixing the problem on kind of child labor and modern slavery. Now, to your question, being transparent about what we do also means that you open yourself to criticism, and we're absolutely happy to get criticism. What's quite difficult is that when you try to do the right thing and you are kind of open and transparent about your supply chain, we publish each year a fair report. So if you go onto our website homepage, we essentially share everything about how we do business, what we do, the number of farmers we work with, the profit that we make, and we proactively look for child labor, because only by finding those issues can you help fix and remediate them. And let's be completely honest, every single chocolate brand out there has child labor in their supply chain. So in West Africa, I mentioned the 1.56 million children. To put this into perspective, that's 1 every 2 children in cocoa growing communities that's involved in child labor. That's huge. In the cooperatives that we work with, that rate drops to 3.9%. So we still find, because we actively look for child labor, because only then can you do something about it. And sometimes remediating it can be simple things like the kids don't have a birth certificate, so they can't go to school. So then what we do is we help the families get the birth certificate so they can go back into the kind of education system. Another example, again, when we were having this conversation when I joined Tony's, and I was kind of finding out all those little things about what we do and why we do things the way we do them. You're fascinated because they're simple, small things that you can do about it. like, the school will be too far from the kids' home, so we provide them with a bike and they can cycle to the school. So like small things, but like only by actively looking for issues can you actually take responsibility and do something about it. So I don't know how many of you will read The Times, but we've had an article published recently that talked about, and the headline was like quite annoyingly misleading. The headline was, Tony's found 1,700 cases of child labour in their supply chain. Now obviously when everything you do and everything that you communicate to consumers and to your customers is about kind of slave-free chocolate, that headline is not great, right? If you read the article, it's nothing new. We publish those numbers every year because only by finding those instances can you fix them. But what do consumers do? They read the headlines and they straight away kind of make up their mind about, oh God, these guys are supposed to be the good guys, and yet, like the headline is the only thing that people will remember. They might not go, to your point, like be inquisitive, be curious, don't just take things for like, at face value. And it's incredibly difficult, right? But like that's why we invest so much of our time having those meaningful conversations with people. We'll attend conferences. We know last month was Fair Trade Fortnight, so we attended, I think, 20 different events at universities, speaking to students who want to know and are inquisitive and are curious. But unfortunately, that's not, the general. That's not the general trend. Not everyone wants to know. Not everyone wants to spend the time looking for the information and kind of like being curious. But we do encourage, same as you said earlier, we want consumers to ask questions to their favorite brands. Like, we want people to be inquisitive and kind of ask Cadbury's and Mars and Nestle and Ferrero, like, what are they doing about fixing those issues of child labor and modern slavery? Because let's be honest, they exist. We try to do something about it, so should they, right? Like, everyone should take responsibility. And the reason they don't is because it's not profitable. Being sustainable is not profitable, right? But we hopefully prove that, we started as a small brand. We're quite, we're small. We're only 15 years old. We started in the Netherlands 15 years ago. We're now 20% of the market in Holland. We're the biggest brand. We launched in the UK 3 years ago. And we've proved that we can be profitable whilst allowing everyone in our value chain to make money, to make to earn a decent living out of, from their contribution to making chocolate. So it is possible. We are, I guess, living proof that you can be profitable and yet be fair to everyone involved in your value chain. You just need to, be reasonable with the margin you want to make.
Yeah, I think that leads on really nicely to this, what we were talking about earlier, Aurelie touched on as well, like this whole thing of kind of communication. I guess, the thing of disinformation, but then also how to be transparent with communication. But then also, of course, when you kind of read headlines, you take that as face value. A lot of the time, that's the first thing that you see. And a lot of the things that we've been researching at Colèchi as well, the team have been kind of thinking about this thing about, call-out culture, is that actually an effective way to be telling people things? Should we just like pull brands out and then they're kind of cancelled? Like, is that how we're going to start giving people responsibility? But I think what you said in terms of actually it's collaborative. We have, even though Tony's not the one producing the chocolate and it's an individual company, we are still buying into it or investing into it. So do you not have a role as well in terms of just how we are in everything? Should we kind of look at things a bit more collaborative when it comes to our responsibility and not just put it on one person to kind of blame or think that they're the ones who have, created some sort of damage? How can we kind of put ourselves into that as well? So just to kind of think about how we can kind of better communicate social impact, I think it would be interesting to hear from everyone actually, because I know you all kind of work with different clients as well, and trying to kind of push some of these conversations onto, I guess, a lot of bigger brands who might have so many levels to them that it can be a bit conflicting when you have one department that's really interested in biomaterials and they're working on, I don't know, one shoe, but then also a lot of their other company might be doing something completely different that's actually feeding into a bad system. So just on this question of communication, it'll be good to kind of for everyone to kind of answer just how we think that brands should kind of better communicate their social impact. I think maybe Vlora, you want to start, but in this instance, it would be good to know from your perspective, particularly kind of when things are produced abroad, how can we kind of communicate when you're speaking almost on behalf of others as well, and a supply chain that's doesn't have as much visibility?
Yeah, it's quite hard. Like we've always had and it's quite unique, I guess, for a chocolate brand, but we've always had a very strict non-paid media policy. So in Holland, we became number one, like 20% of the market, without spending money on above the line. So like no TV ads, no kind of like billboards outdoors. Like it's all been like the growth came from the word of mouth, for like people telling the story on our behalf. Obviously, we take the risk that they don't tell it properly, but we make sure that we communicate at every touch point. And we've always said our best marketing tool is our product. So like if you pick up a bar of Tony's, you open the wrapper, and then inside we essentially printed our manifesto. So we exist because today child labour and modern slavery exists, and we exist to change that. But yeah, to your point about like how do we communicate? We have broken that rule for the first time in the UK back in November, because so each year the farm gate price, which is the price set by the government in Ivory Coast and Ghana, each year they kind of they update, I guess, the price of cocoa, and that price dropped by 25%, like leaving farmers in even more poverty than they were before. Which also means that in turn, those big companies just all of a sudden make a lot more profit. Unfair, right? Like it's that industry is so unequal, and there's so much profit, right? Like those big companies, the Mondelez, the Ferrero and Mars, like they make so much profit, and it's all kind of also published again down to people to like who are curious to go on the website and just look. But we did break that rule, and we decided to have for a month, so the whole month of October, we had billboards, not talking about the product, but talking about the mission. So it was all about raising awareness of the fact that modern slavery and child labour exist, and that we exist to change that, and encouraging people to join us on our mission, right? Like that's incredibly important. But to our within our level, like obviously our social media, and then the team and the people, like we just encourage people to tell the story for us. Within our reach.
Yeah, and then open that up to everyone else as well, just kind of how do you think brands should better communicate their social impact?
Really quickly, I just want to touch on what you said. I think that it's very hard for brands to hold each other accountable. So you can't really like send your model to another brand and say, please can you adopt what we're doing? And they should, because actually they all use the same raw material, which is cocoa, right? So it's like jewelry with gold. It's the same problem. There's like lots of problems with gold mining in South America as well. So if you look at this in this way, we can't hold each other accountable, and we can't put the responsibility on you as a consumer. So I think the only thing that the customer needs to do is to hold us accountable, and that's your power. Like regain your power, because this is what you can do. Now the responsibility of change is on us, not on you. But you can provoke the change by keep asking questions, But what you said in the headline, very interesting, because actually whenever you try to communicate something, it just turns out completely different than what you wanted to say. And actually it's because the other brands don't want to uncover what's going on in their supply chain. You are, and you discovered that, and people will think, oh wow, so it only exists in your brand, in your supply chain, but it's the opposite. So I would say that probably fighting misconception and greenwashing, and I'm going to give the power to you guys, because it's all about greenwashing in our industry. It's all about trying to fight the misconception that's kind of force-fed to you guys from bigger corporations, that you should buy this because of that, or you should follow this trend. So, to you guys.
Yeah, I think my favourite greenwash at the moment is bamboo. I don't know how many people think bamboo is a good product in here, but it's my favourite greenwash that I see every day right now. It's pretty bad. Bamboo is not what it says it is. Bamboo as a crop, it's fast growing, it doesn't take up a lot of space, it grows tall, it doesn't use a lot of water. As far as it goes, it looks like on the label to cotton. And I see these cuddly pandas like everywhere, like people are like, oh, bamboo socks, and they're using like pandas all over this. And it's the face of greenwashing right now for me, because this is like real manipulation, like down to its core from fibres. It's not just a brand saying they're doing something sustainable and then you realise it's polyester. This is something that people aren't going to understand is actually greenwashing, and the processing of bamboo uses very toxic chemicals. It uses lots of sulfur. I think it's a CS2. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. But this is like really, really harmful. So it basically becomes viscose, and the processing of viscose is not good. So in America, I think it was 10 to 15 years ago, the US government passed laws on this to say to brands in America, you can't do this anymore. Like, this is greenwashing. And in the UK, that is not something. And I think that the legislation here is just like shocking to see that something like that. And then my co-founder has passionately written to the government a few times now to sort of like complain about this. But these things are going on, and I think just being able to recognise and doing your research, like Aurelie always says, do your research, like be inquisitive. Like, I see so many students as well, like using bamboo, and like even when I was in uni, I was like, oh, that sounds interesting, and then you look into it and you find out, and you know, especially if you're going to go and work for brands, these things are going to be changing in the next few years, and you're going to have to be a lot more transparent and have that certification. And you know, I think brands are getting away with mislabeling stuff like bamboo. You know, we've seen that a lot of it. I think I see it basically every day. Same thing happens with people jumping on the back of lensing with some of their stuff, jumping on the lighter cell that's not made by lensing, and like not knowing the sort of transparency behind that. It's really easy to spot if you read their marketing guidelines. You know he's not got a license, but I think that there's a lot more in terms of certification. I think it's great to have that documentation and get what you can. There was an Indian mill that approached me about 8 months ago now and asked me to do some work with them, and they sent me all their certifications for their fabrics, and I was like, cool, I really checked them out. We sent them to the certification body. They were like, yeah, no, this is all like legit. And then I looked into the ethical side of it, and they only employed men. There were 77 men working there, no women. They didn't want to engage with the sort of maternity policies that were ruled there, so they didn't employ any women. Then I looked into how many men were allowed holiday. So 2 men, for some reason, they didn't explain to me why, weren't guaranteed any holiday. And then I looked at the age, and then only 65 of them are over the age of 18. So I was like, so when they were declaring me this paperwork, and they were quite proud of it when they handed this to me, and I was like, I support a lot of female brands. I got like Birdsong, who just won best ethical brand with Marie Claire and Ravens. And it's amazing to see what they do. And then I was like, I'm not ever going to take a fabric that doesn't employ women, you know, from India, regardless of all of the accreditations it has. The actual fabric, you have to have balance, and these things have to come together. So I think recognizing that and knowing not to just stop because something says bamboo or organic on it. I think 1 in 6 certifications in the organic industry are fake right now in the organic cotton industry. And you know, find someone who can go and check out your certification, take it back to the certification board and ask them, you know, and be looking out for these kind of things, because that's really what has to be done to know it. And I guess when you're first starting out as a student or a brand, it's not always easy to know where to go for that. But you know, find people like we do, or consultants or people who are doing this kind of thing, to really understand a lot more depth about your supply chain. But you have to have both sides. It's just not something I could do. I just said to that brand, oh, thank you, but no thank you.
I think, as you said, it's just brands get away with anything, just splashing buzzwords on their websites like sustainable, organic, carbon negative, just because they pay people to plant trees. I just want to remind everyone here in the room. Trees that are just seedlings, and they're not going to capture carbon before like 25 years when they grow tall. So just anything that people are claiming online or anywhere, just double check that what they're talking about has a certification behind it that's valid, or that they actually do the work. Like right here, a brand that does the work traces all the way back to the beginning of their supply chain, which is the raw material that they use and depend on, and they also find the weakest and we say most vulnerable chain of the supply chain, which is the worker at the beginning who's harvesting that raw material. Their whole family depends on this industry, so they're in a position almost we're dominating, and they're in a position where they can't fight for themselves. Now, many of them are literate, so I guess you have this problem in your supply chain as well, where you have to almost go and file legal papers for them when they want to sue some companies working with them. So you have to understand the biggest problem here is that we exploit these vulnerable communities. And I think that is very common in fashion in your industry as well, is that the legislations are different from one country to another. So you're almost fighting different countries at the same time. And the lawsuits are also very different because, you know, I think that's a problem in fashion. We're not talking about this today, but the fair pay and the wages in the fashion industry. I guess that you guys do audits for the manufacturers you work with, so you understand how much are they paid, how much is that compared to the living wage in that country, and also, as you said, supporting women, because obviously, I don't know the stats, but it's probably 90% garment workers are women. So yeah, very interesting.
I think a big part of this as well is fashion education as a whole, because probably a lot of you have gone to fashion school and these aren't the type of topics that you discuss. You know, you're not taught how to design for circularity, you're not taught how to investigate your supply chain, to question manufacturers, to find sustainable materials and what even is sustainable. You know, how do you know about bamboo if it's, you know, all the problems with the supply chain? You don't go through this kind of educational training to be able to go out into the industry and be prepared to actually build a sustainable brand or design for circularity or do any of these things unless you're doing it on your own. So I think a big part of what we do as well is trying to spread that knowledge and open up these conversations and bring that education into the light. So we also work with Center for Sustainable Fashion to develop free online courses, and right now there's a series of 4, I think 3 of them are out, called Fashion Values. So Fashion Values Nature, Fashion Values Society, Fashion Values Culture, and so on. So it's a great free online resource where you can go and really get like super detailed, I think, best case studies you can find, amazing information to help you then be able to go and question the brands and know what to look for and know how to actually interrogate these brands and manufacturers and textile producers. If you're working to build your own collection, you have like more context, and just kind of sets you on a clear direction. You will be surprised to find how many good, amazing case studies are out there to actually encourage you and give you hope. Because a lot of times we talk about all the problems, but we don't often talk so much about the solutions. So it's a really good resource that I would encourage all of you to do it. Always social media is a great way if you follow like certain creators and educators on there who are sharing those nice little bite-sized bits of information that you can take with you. But definitely do your own research, and education is a big part of it. And it takes time, you know, and it takes a lot of energy and focus to be able to do proper research and really integrate sustainability into your collection.
Yeah, super important. At 2:30 we are going to be discussing education as well in terms of this conversation and wider as well. And just linking it back to food as well, like we always kind of say the same thing in terms of how, you know, from every stage of school you kind of learn about your diet and healthy eating, and that's kind of embedded in our education system whether you're studying nutrition or not. And it's kind of like how can we have more transparency about things that we wear as well, like where the things that we wear come from, where our fibres come from. So it definitely is like such an important part, and I think if we can kind of get that embedded into our education system, then it's definitely the right step. But also just going back to what we were talking about with ethics, it would be interesting to hear from all of you in terms of how you think we can better support farmers and those within our supply chain. So kind of how can we actually make a positive impact? How can we better collaborate with each other? What does that look like? And what kind of policies do we need to put in place, or what are you doing existing within your own companies to make sure that this is happening?
I'll just be super quick because obviously my supply chain is based here, but probably if I was in this situation, I'd probably look at the entire supply chain, just double check that everything just complies with the law and not just like, you know, local or whatever you think the law is, but actually go and understand what kind of policies you've got in this country, what kind of policies we have here, and try to find a middle ground because it's very hard to, I'm probably sure you experienced this as well. And probably, you know, there's like lots of brands that have internal lawyers and they employ lawyer firms to go and defend the people who actually can't defend themselves, and that happens quite often because you work with vulnerable communities as well. You were talking about finding paperwork for them and try to sort it out this way. I think you can do a lot of stuff on the side of the law, and you can leverage the law to be able to help those communities, because most of the time it's because they don't have access to local representatives, lawyers, or people who can be behind them and defend them. At the same time, so that's the people side of things. Sustainability side of things, I think we just need to like all come together as an industry and demand those policies to be implemented. And the problem is that the policies need to be global. We can't have double standards from one country to another. It's not going to work because big corporations always find a way to cut corners. So it's the same as in the food industry, and I think fashion needs more transparency, like the food industry, so that you know what you're wearing, you know where it comes from. At the moment, if you look at your garments label, it says made in blah blah blah. So it doesn't show you anything else. It will just show you the country of origin, and you know, Mas, because you also have textiles on your platform, that the textiles have their own story. Garments have a story, textiles have another story, and obviously they have an end-of-life story. So you need to understand, and it's just for me, just mind-boggling that we don't have those things divulged to the public. Like Mas was talking about bamboo, you know, it's not going to solve anything. So just be very aware of where things come from and where they're going afterwards is probably the best thing you can look at the moment.
One thing that we try to do, and again, like that's quite hard because last year I think we worked with about 9,000 farmers across the cooperatives that we work with in Ivory Coast and Ghana. And to your point about how can we support farmers, like we try to like just have real conversations where we listen to like what's important to them. You know, at the end of the day, they know better how to kind of like improve their livelihoods and like one thing that we found out, and that's also why we kind of set up our 5 sourcing principles the way we did, is that one thing that was incredibly important to them was that long-lasting relationship piece. So knowing that for kind of 5 years, they will get paid a fair wage for the cocoa that they grow was as important as getting paid that additional premium. And the additional kind of thing that we found out is that it actually takes 5 years for a cocoa tree to grow from the moment you kind of plant the seed. That also means that you tackle deforestation like that. So like for 5 years, they build kind of like business plans, but they also work on kind of the longer piece, so like the longer term piece, like making sure that the land is not kind of damaged, that they make the most of kind of the space, the land that they have available to work with, kind of maximizing that space, but also making sure that it's fit, it'll be fit for purpose in the longer term, not just next year, but like in the next 5, 10, 15 years. So yeah, it's about like, listening to what's important to them and then supporting them in the best possible way. But like, we really treat them as equals. Like, we're not, we are partners. It's like it's a business relationship. And like, I'll speak for myself. I hate this idea of like seeing ourselves as like bigger or like more important. Like, it's absolutely not the case. Like, we are business partners, so there should be a kind of an equal foot in how you envisage relationships and business partnerships with farmers. I think that's important.
Yeah, well, at the moment we're not actually working directly with farmers because we're at the end of life cycle. But one way that we do kind of integrate with the supply chain is through our consultancy services. So when designers or small brands come to us and they say, I want to make a sustainable circular collection, but I'm not sure where to start, how do I do this? That's where we then go and investigate, okay, well, what kind of designs are you trying to make? What kind of material is the most regenerative, circular, sustainable thing we can find? And then we go and we have those difficult conversations with the manufacturers, the textile mills, people who are producing the trims, all the components, as you were saying, even down to the thread and the packaging and the labeling. So we really do a deep dive into all of these things. It takes a lot of time and a lot of difficult conversations, and sometimes we have to move from one manufacturer supplier to another because we're not really convinced of their sustainability accreditations. But I think certifications is an amazing way to be sure that who you're working with is doing all the things that they say they do, and also just picking up the phone and ringing people and seeing if they can answer your questions like correctly, or give you the answers that you want to hear, because sometimes when you're reading through the website, you're reading through their accreditations, okay, that's one thing. But if you pick up the phone and ask those questions about, okay, well, this is what it says here, but what happens after that? Or how do we know that this is going to be okay? Or how do we know that, you're doing all these things that you say you're doing? And sometimes that's the really time-consuming and challenging part, but we do try our best to source within the most local, regenerative, circular ways that we can and build collections as best we can. The reality is that the industry is not perfect, so when you are creating any collection, there's always going to be some impact. Like, it's not the ideal situation that we would like to have, but that is changing. And when you call and you ask those difficult questions, it then kind of puts the fire under them, under those manufacturers and textile producers and raw material producers to actually go and make those changes and deliver what you're asking for, because you're then going to move your business somewhere else if they don't. So I think we do have a lot of power, and that's something that we try to do within our consultancy service.
Yeah, just to add back to the question of in the fashion industry, there's a lot of change going on right now. There's a lot of demand for high value items that are really low cost, and that cost gets squeezed back all the way to the farmer, and it goes. I don't want to kind of ask you guys, I don't know what your experience is on this, but with some of the mills and farms that we work with, I've ended up having to, our company fork out money for some of their certifications because they are crazy expensive sometimes, and they've got to focus on, I'd rather they focus on paying their workers, and when we get there, we'll make sure you've got the certification. But there's been times where I'm like, no, you've got a really good thing, we're going to part finance, so I'll put in £5,000 towards that certification from our company. And we did that at the beginning when we were first starting, because we were like, we know we've got these people who are doing this, and over COVID there was a lot of struggles. I don't know about your experience, or if you've had any experience with these certification bodies who do actually demand quite a lot of money up at the beginning of that process. And sometimes it isn't really that easy, and so what we're trying to do is help those people who are doing that and can get that accreditation. But I don't know if you've had any.
I think that's what you were saying as well, about the sustainability is a cost for a business, and so if you're doing everything right, you're already bearing a lot of the costs. So doing the certification is doing an extra mile and more cost, and I think I completely understand what you mean, because sometimes you do everything right, you just don't have the certification to prove it, but you're actually doing it in reality.
Yeah, definitely. I just think it's difficult unless you're a big, my co-founder worked at Nike, and he was able to put pressure as the head of innovation there. He was able to put pressure on mills to be like, hey, I want you to get this certification, or I want you to do this. And even then, he found out that the products that they gave from the mills weren't always, what they wanted, but they were able to kind of go to a mill and put the pressure on getting the certification, because they're, M&S can do the same thing, we want you to have that. But as a small brand, you're stuck with what that mill's already got, and if that mill is already stretched and they're not making enough money from that. I know COVID there was a lot of cancellations, there was a lot of frustrated stock in the industry, and I guess that's another thing, just watch out for the dead stock.
You're also saying that some certifications don't go far enough.
That's why I was mentioning the reason we work with Fair Trade is because they are the only certification that guarantees farmers a premium paid in cash. And then, to your point earlier around kind of how do you guarantee how can consumers have faith that when they buy a product that has a logo that it actually does what it says it does? And one thing that we do is that everything that we publish on that report that we publish each year, every single word is audited by PwC. And so, I'd hate to be part of that team that is in charge of writing that report, because I can see the stress that it is to make sure that every number, every statement, everything that goes on there needs to be fact-checked. And sometimes they'll make us change a word because they're like, how can you guarantee this? I was like, actually, okay, maybe we'll rephrase it in a different way. But that transparency does come with a cost. But we think that that should be the standard. Some people see us as a social enterprise. We're not. We're a business that makes a profit, and you need to be able to do that if you want to inspire change. Because at the end of the day, businesses do need to make money. But what we're saying is you don't need to make billions of profit especially if people at the start of the value chain live in poverty. Like, there's enough money there for everyone. You just need to kind of make a reasonable cut.
Yeah, definitely. So we've just got a final 2 questions, and then we're going to go to all audience questions. So just what we'll touch on now is just, so what is the standard? What can we learn, especially from the food industry? You touched on it before, Aurelie, where it's kind of like with food on your package, you kind of have every single ingredient, you have the calories, you have everything, you know what's going to go inside of you. Most of the time it says where it's made, who's made it a lot of the time. With that, apart from that, what are some of the other things that you can maybe take from the food industry to kind of put standards in fashion?
Just really quickly, I think there's a big health problem that a lot of people ignore, is synthetic dyes. Well, just to make it short, there's over 8,000 chemicals used in the fashion industry to color our garments. Some of them are very heavily regulated, but some of them aren't. And actually, lots of science papers show that if you wear polyester or any plastic-based fibers, there's a strange kind of chemical reaction that happens where you're kind of absorbing some chemicals and some negative substances that are in those garments because of the color and because of the composition of the fiber. But that's, a study that's going to have to come out soon because I think it's really impacting our health. So that's why a lot of people do now work on natural dyes and that kind of replacement. To go back to your question, I think this is very important that we understand that what's been the standard for many, many, many years because of the 60s. We inherited a lot of synthetic fibers, that we actually just agree on the risks that they pose. And then, we can move forward because the consumer just needs it. The consumer deserves to know what they're buying. And the whole kind of like traceability of it is obviously what happened to this garment before it was made, but also what is its life cycle and what it does to your body eventually. We just take it for granted because not many people know about that.
Yeah, even laundering, that process as well. It's all of those different parts, just out what you were saying, for the circularity. I think, especially with your synthetics, just watch out.
And the end-of-life process is so complicated as well. Like right now, there is no policy that says that people who are producing textile waste can't just send it to landfill, can't just have it be incinerated, can't just do whatever with it. So for us to go in and say, we actually want you to pay a fee for us to then recycle it properly, that's a really big challenge. And if there was a piece of legislation that said it's actually illegal to send your textile waste to landfill or incineration, then they would all be running to say, okay, I need to get in line with this policy. How can I make sure I'm doing that as fast and affordable and sustainable as possible? And so, there really is no legislation at this point. There is a really interesting law happening, it's in conversation in New York about creating a law that would limit the amount of textile waste that brands can throw straight into landfill. So if that actually passes, that will be a really amazing, game-changing industry standard that a lot of other cities hopefully will bring on board. But a lot of it does come down to policy, and at the moment it's just a free-for-all. So.
100%. You need certain certifications and standards. So, like a restaurant, you can't just sell food from anywhere. But then when it comes to fashion, I guess anyone can kind of make a brand and kind of make it as big as they want. But there isn't anyone stopping you in terms of responsibility or saying, what's going to happen 6 days afterwards. So I think it definitely is a thing of legislation and policy, and there's so much that needs to be done in that aspect. But the final question is just to kind of think about what can consumers do then. I do hate using the word, but I guess it's not an alternative now. But what can, us people who are maybe buying into brands, consumers, how can consumers support farmers? How can we support transparency within the supply chain? What role can they kind of play as, maybe collaborators of brands and different kind of people in the industry?
I think, essentially fashion is built on trends. So you all know, if you're journalists or fashion designers or even just fashionistas, it's built on trends, but sustainability is not a trend. It is not, and it should not be a trend. So I think, in a way, it's almost trying to work against the grain of what you're being fed online or by your companies, doing some kind of greenwashing. Greenwashing is everywhere. I think there is now, it's moving towards getting a law that prevents you from doing fake or false advertising, which is really good. except who has the time to tackle every single brand in the universe? So I would say probably like just revisit the brands that you buy, understand why you buy them, understand why you like them, and understand that eventually buying something to last and to keep for a long time is probably the best option. So I don't want to guilt trip anyone here, say don't buy any plastic because sometimes you will need it. So performance wear or for waterproof outerwear and things, because that's going to solve some of your problem if people stop. This throwaway culture, that's probably the first thing that you can fight your own kind of gut feelings.
I think you have a point. I think it's about encouraging people to consume less but better. And it's quite difficult, right? Like, you're in front of the fixture in the supermarket and you're like, okay, well, that has plastic and that has, like X, Y, and Z. But I think big corporations, big brands will listen to what people want. And I think we are seeing a few trends, and we have been seeing trends in the food and drinks industry for the last, past few years. You mentioned plastic, but, we can say the same about like a vegan diet or just kind of like, dairy-free and so on. And, you see a lot more brands now, putting out there, launching products that are dairy-free, vegan, and so on, which means that brands listen to what people want. So I think it's kind of, I guess, down to us to put our money where our values are. And sometimes it does cost a little bit more. But perhaps by buying less and better, we can kind of like make that up somehow.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I think there's a really nice end-of-life industry emerging with rental. If you have a special occasion, you rent a dress or a suit or whatever. I think there's really nice resale, so much resale happening around, specifically in London, which is amazing. And one thing I would encourage everyone to do is to not bring your clothes to the charity shop donation bin, because most of that is going to go to landfill and exported overseas. So the best thing you can do is try to find a new loving home for that piece, whether that's giving it to a friend or a family member, or even posting it on different platforms, Depop, Vinted, whatever, trying to find a really nice home for a piece that you have, and also repairing things. So whether that's, I have this old jumpsuit, I don't really like it anymore, it's got a hole in it, let me just stitch up that hole and then send it off to someone else who's really going to appreciate that. And I think part of something I try to do, because I do this a lot with my old clothes, is also try to tell a story and build connection to that new person who's getting that piece, and say, I purchased this in New York back in the day, I've worn it so many places, I hope you really enjoy it. Make them feel emotionally connected to this new piece, even though they bought it for £10, whatever. But just trying to expand that life cycle and make sure that we're not putting so much overwhelming pressure on the charity shops that then have to go out and export overseas. So I think that's one thing we can do with our, because at the end of the day, we do get sick of things after you've worn it for so many years, ready for a change, ready to swap it out. So I think that's one thing we can do to be a little bit more responsible there.
Yeah, I think touching on both of your points, there's a huge polarization in the fashion industry right now between the rise of your ethical consumer, which is great, and then you have your fast fashion lovers. And I just urge designers to maybe engage with those fast fashion lovers and find out what they're doing, because clearly, as you mentioned as well, people are responding to the demand. So don't see it as, okay, at the moment it's really awful, there's a lot of fast fashion rise, but learning about how these consumers, what they're buying, how they're buying it, what their thoughts are. It is about sort of wear once on Instagram, and that's where rental is so good. But I think knowing what they're doing in the rental, how they're looking after that in the end life. There are some great brands. I think Hair is one that's doing really quite well on that sort of laundering as well. But I think studying that side of it and understanding the polarization and why we do have such a big gap, and how we can kind of get people to follow suit and sort of being more conscious in their decision making is really what I'm urging for from consumers. But it's not hard, because brands have got to have that responsibility. You've got to as Aurelie said, stick up for yourself and kind of get your power back. So
yeah, definitely. So we've got some time for just a few questions. I know you had your hand up for a while, so if maybe just one person answers each question, that would be great. Would you like to ask one question?
My question is, I've been asking this question close to 10 years when I go to a lot of fashion events because my roots are from India. And I see this massive polarization between what's happening on the ground in India, is what my friends and people tell me, and what's being spoken about here, sustainability. Here, sustainability is going back to the farm, stick to the farmer. Over there, it's what we call bani, water. Water is collapsing. What's made it collapse even more in the last 10, 15 years is this complete fallacy of lies where put a solar panel on the roof of the factory, don't look at the scope 3, the externalities of that solar panel, so that the group of women in that factory making this jacket, it's all cushy, it's all sustainable. But in externalities, when we look at sustainability, we have to look at where did the solar power come from. I can guarantee you Western Ghats, Jharkhand, Mullen forests, the key forests, sit on the most richest resource of minerals in India, where mostly the indigenous are, and mostly the women are. Those women are going to be enslaved in sexual and labour for what product? To get those resources for the solar panels, wind turbines and electric cars. Most people say, oh, well, you can't solve all the problems at the same time. I says, you've just negated the very supply chain of this jacket because you didn't look at the external costs of that solar panel. And for me, the real issue is anyone looking at scope 3, which is going beyond your factory, beyond your remit here, and actually saying, did this solar panel somehow negate the whole LCA of this jacket, ultimately? And the last thing I'd like to say with the water is, if you have shortages or blockages in the supply chain like you've seen last 2 years, COVID, whatever, where the materials are coming from Ghana or South America or India, if there's another blockage in the supply chain, and water is not being mentioned as the baseline of the conversation, how sustainable is your supply chain and what provenance of materials? We talk about mushrooms, but really, in fact, we should be talking about cannabis, we should be talking about hemp, we should be talking about flax.
But actually, mushrooms grow on hemp. So our entire supply chain is based on hemp. We work with hemp farmers.
I'm saying that's great. What I'm saying is